Ladies and gentlemen, before we commence the event, we would like to remind you once again that food and drinks are not allowed in the auditorium. And please move up to the front rows so that you can get a better view and so that we can leave space for the chairs for new guests to come in. Thank you. A warm welcome for Professor Catherine Wolfram, William Barton Rogers Professor of Energy Economics, MIT Sloan School of Management. And a warm welcome to Bapak Yusuf Wanandi, the Vice Chair of the Board of Trustees, CSIS Foundation. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, all distinguished guests and excellencies. It is such a pleasure to have you here and welcome you to the Decarbonization for Development Lab's lecture on the future of border carbon adjustment policy amidst global trade war. How should developing countries respond? Featuring Professor Catherine Wolfram. Please give a round of applause for this event. Welcome, Ibu Mari. Before we commence this event, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Nadia Daulay, and I will be your host for today. To get things going, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and excellencies, to start our event, please join me in welcoming Bapak Yose Rizal Damuri, the Executive Director of CSIS Indonesia, to give his remarks. Pak Yose, you may have the floor.
Very good morning to you all. It is a great pleasure to welcome you at CSIS and also to DfD lab lectures. I like also allow me to extend my special welcome actually to Professor Elka Pangestu, Special Envoy of the President for International Trade and Multilateral Cooperations, and also Bu Mari is one of the board member of CSIS Foundation here. And of course, I like to extend my warm welcome to our special guest today, Professor Catherine Wolfram, the William Barton Rogers Professor of Energy Economics from MIT Sloan School of Management from Massachusetts in the United States. She traveled all the way to Jakarta to give us a chance to interact and to give lectures in our today's events. Well, perhaps I'd like to give you some brief explanations about the DfD Lab. The DfD Lab is our initiative at CSIS here to examine and to follow decarbonization initiative of economic activities, especially on the interlinkage between trade, production, investments, and also climate actions, climate initiative. The DfD Lab has conducted various discussions, and if I'm not mistaken, so we have already had 3 lectures in the past. One from Professor Jeffrey Sachs, another one from Professor Ricardo Hausmans, and today we're really honored to have Professor Catherine Wolfram to be in our lectures today. So there are quite many activities that the DfD Lab have done during the 2 years of its activities, and we expect to have more and more activities to look at, to examine the interlinkage between climate actions and productions and economic activities in general, because it's getting more and more important nowadays. Just this morning, we heard that the United States released a list of countries that will face new revised reciprocal tariff starting this next August. So this actually indicate this marks a key moment in our global trend that has been building for the last several years, actually. It also reminds us about the reality of our world today. The economic decisions are deeply connected to geopolitical interests and also geopolitical tension. At the same time, we are facing the urgent challenge of climate change, which is reshaping how we produce, how we trade, how we also grow our economic activities. All those issues, geopolitics, trade, economic activities, and climate crisis are no longer separate. They are all connected, and together they are reshaping our global economy today. So the big question is how countries, developing countries, especially like Indonesia, stay ahead of all of this trend. How to balance growth, how to take climate responsibility, and how to keep up with our aspirations to have more inclusive growth. That's why we are here to discuss, actually, and to listen to from our two very distinguished speakers, Ibu Mari Pangestu and Professor Catherine Wolfram. They are all knowledgeable speakers on these issues, and we're gonna learn a lot about all those interesting and also important issues. And even better, all the speakers are women, actually. Yeah. So we are really honored to have these two distinguished speakers, distinguished women that will improve our understanding on the issues and how we can perhaps can come up with more concrete solutions on this issue, especially for Indonesia. So once again, welcome to CSIS, welcome to our DfD lectures, and enjoy the discussion today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pak Yose, for your insightful remarks. Next, we are very privileged to listen to a keynote speech by Professor Mari Elka Pangestu, the Vice Chair of the National Economic Council, Republic of Indonesia. Bu Mari, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Catherine Wolfram from MIT, our distinguished speaker today. And welcome to everybody who's come here today from, I think, very many sectors, government, as well as international agencies, international representatives, and of course, the Decarbonization for Development Lab and CSIS colleagues and partners, and all the experts and stakeholders and team members who have made today's workshop possible. I don't know whether you can put up the slides. Yes, unfortunately I do have slides. So it's not really, this is not really a keynote. I was asked to do the scene setting, if that's the right word for us to use today. So I'm really honored to be here today. This is another important lecture in the series of the Decarbonization Lab Distinguished Speaker series, where it is about sharing our ideas, our interests, and an ability to have this dialogue around a very important topic, or not just for Indonesia, but I think globally. How can you have growth and development, but do it in a sustainable manner? This is a long debate. Is climate and development trade-offs, or are they not necessarily trade-offs? I am in the camp that believes it doesn't have to be trade-offs if you undertake the right strategy. And this is a lot of what we discuss in these various meetings. I think the real trade-off is between inaction today and action today. Right? I think that's the real trade-off. Inaction today is going to cost you future growth, future development in the future, which is irreversible if you let the damage be done on your resources and your sectors and so on. So I'm in that camp, but the how to get there question is really what I think many of our meetings have been about, and I like to think that we have come some way in increasing our understanding how we can achieve both development and growth. And today we will hear a lot about what's happening internationally. And unfortunately, I mean, I woke up this morning, I mean, I couldn't sleep last night watching all the breaking news. And then I woke up this morning with, you know, the love letter that we got today, along with 12 other countries. And it really kind of, you know, made my head a bit explode. And, you know, I was feeling very distracted this morning. But we do face a great deal of global uncertainty, not just in the trade area, but the fact that the US did leave, again, the Paris Agreement. And we have conflict in the Middle East and so on. So there is kind of this, perhaps, backlash for green transition, and this is something we should, you know, we should understand or be cognizant of as the external environment that is facing us. But it should not deter us from our goal for a sustainable growth, you know, that is achieving growth, in even higher growth, maybe 8%, I don't know, but a higher growth, but in a sustainable way, right? I still think that's the key goal for us in the short term, medium term, and the long term. And it should be the defining objective for Indonesia. So I want to do just two things in this key scene setting. First is the importance of decarbonization and this whole green growth agenda of Indonesia. And then also say something about carbon pricing, because today we are going to be talking about CBAM and how it can be actually be the tool to achieve our growth goals. So perhaps just quickly, if you look at this, it's a bit small, but I hope you can see it. You can see that Indonesia is still the 8th largest greenhouse gas emitter globally. And you can see that energy, it used to be forestry and agriculture that was the main contributor to our greenhouse gas emission. But since we were able to control the forest fires, the moratorium on palm oil and other use of forest resources, it has come down. And as a result, the contribution of energy has gone up. And this really shows you the kind of the different contribution of sectors in our emission. And it also shows you in the left graph, you can see that our emissions trajectory closely tracks the economic growth, which presents both a policy challenge and opportunity. So we've been growing, but with increased. So how do we now turn it around so that we continue to grow, but the emissions start coming down? And energy being the biggest contributor sector means that energy transition is key. And you can see on the right side, which is comparing ourselves with the ASEAN peers, our industrial emissions and intensity is significantly higher compared to our ASEAN peers. And this is a structural issue which reflects our dependence on carbon-intensive sectors like cement, steel, and fossil fuels. A number of these sectors are obviously the ones also being targeted with CBAM. So any green growth strategy must address the emissions in these industries, not just the energy sector, but addressing the emissions of these industrial sectors also means you need renewable energy. So it's not separate, it's related. You need the energy transition so that we have the objective of greening these industries, apart from the way they are producing, it's the supply of renewable energy. And this is obviously key when we are talking about how are we going to respond to CBAM. Oops. This visual shows you our pathway to the 2030 enhanced national determined contribution. We are actually in the process of now talking about the second NDC, which was supposed to be submitted this year under the COP commitments. But what we are doing is, okay, let's evaluate, have we achieved the enhanced NDCs by 2030 in the first place? And how should we redesign and reconfigure our second NDC to make it having the right ambition and targets, but making it realistic as well. So just to look at the enhanced NDCs, our emissions need to drop significantly to meet even our enhanced nationally determined contribution targets by 2030, which is only 5 years away, by the way. And it has very ambitious renewable energy. We have ambitious renewable energy goals, but can we actually achieve it? I think that's really the challenge. And this, our NDCs is even more challenged with our ambition of sustaining economic growth of 8% by 2030, which is the government or the president's target. So we have a dual challenge. We must decarbonize without deindustrializing, right? So, sorry, this is a very sensitive clicker. See. Okay. To achieve this 8% GDP growth, let's try to understand better how do we achieve growth and sustainability. You can see this is just one. Sorry, I think I missed this. To achieve the 8% growth sustainably, it's estimated that we need $200 to $250 billion of annual investments between 25 to 2030 to get the cumulative US dollar value of the GDP of $600 to $700 billion. So the big question, and a lot of people who believe in that there's no trade-off between climate and development, focus on this 200 to 250 billion as this is the investment opportunity. This is the growth story that you want. You want to have these investments, but you want these investments in sustainable infrastructure, in energy transition, in greening your industries, right? So if you could do that, then you would achieve both, right? But this is, of course, the how-to is something we all need to think about carefully. If we can really do green infrastructure, green manufacturing, renewable energy in an efficient way. The other number that all of us economists talk about in Indonesia is the I-COR, the investment capital output ratio, which is still pretty high at 6.8%. So how do we have green and efficient and effective investments? I guess that's the objective. And then the how-to story, the policies, the regulations, the institutions, and so on. Really, so how we deploy this capital, and how do we, if we design it right, who's going to invest, right? It's not government investment. Maybe government, there's been numbers out there also to show that government, according to the Ministry of Finance, can probably fund about 1/3 to 20% of the needs of the green investment we need for climate transition. But we're going to need much more. We're going to need private capital, blended finance, green bonds, and carbon pricing must play a role in all that. And sectoral prioritization and institutional coordination is going to determine how effective this investment is. So a little bit of sectoral prioritization for growth. You need to kind of look at, okay, the key drivers are consumption, investment, and exports. And we do want to focus on investments, but which sectors? to prioritize. It includes green manufacturing, including the downstreaming industries, whether it's green nickel or EV batteries or renewable energy, sustainable tourism and digital tech. That box on the right-hand side is prioritizing some of the industries where we could have competitiveness. And how do we transition to green industry will be essential to maintain competitiveness and meet our climate commitments. A little bit about CBAM, the topic of today's discussion. Is CBAM a threat or an opportunity? I think Catherine hopefully will convince us that it's an opportunity, right? It can be a threat to our exports or a catalyst for accelerated green transformation. It imposes a carbon price, as you know, on 6 carbon-intensive commodities. It's a challenge, but it also incentivizes cleaner production, especially if we want to retain market access in Europe. And I know that in our dialogue, in my role as a special envoy, we are, as I said, talking about doing a lot of discussions on NDCs and revising the carbon market regulations. The Ministry of Industry is actually very aware of this, figuring out how the different industries should respond and the capacity building that's needed and so on. Just the modeling done by CSIS and friends at CSIS, including Ardhi leading this study on the macroeconomic of CBAM, is actually small because our export share to the EU is modest and only a few products are affected for now. However, carbon emissions do reduce slightly more under CBAM than under our own current carbon tax. And this is due, not surprisingly, to the higher effective carbon price under CBAM. So on the left, you see the macroeconomic indicators are slightly declining under both CBAM and carbon tax scenarios. On the right, you can see the emission impact is more significant with CBAM. So the key takeaway is that carbon pricing works best when it finds the sweet spot, where it is not too high that can jeopardize our industry, but it is also high enough for industry to decarbonize and take a comprehensive approach, which ours isn't. So let me just close with a few points on carbon price, on our carbon market, the progress and the gaps. Compared to other countries like China and Korea, our compliance carbon market is still in early stages. It's got limited coverage, low carbon prices, and relatively few participating entities. The key is not just expanding the scope, but also enhancing market liquidity and predictability for investors. You can see the trends. The participants have grown, but the market value remains really modest. And for carbon pricing to drive the real behavior change that we want, it must be integrated into industrial and fiscal policy and not as a standalone tool, right? So let me then conclude by saying that, we need to design a green, resilient, and inclusive green growth policy that is integrated with carbon pricing and other instruments. So you need to have the integrated picture of the green growth strategy, which shows you that it's not a trade-off, but you need to design the strategy that will bring you to a 8%, say 6 to 8% growth, which identifies which sectors are contributing and how the sectors are related to each other and how the sectors contribute to growth and the macro development, but do it in a sustainable way. And I think competitiveness is an important component of the way we understand our growth strategy. If you don't undertake sustainability and have a green growth strategy, you're going to be out of the competition. Because today, to be competitive, you have to be part of the sustainable supply chain. And CBAM is one component or one tool within that. So you need to identify the clear targets. You can have ambition, but with ambition must come very strong reforms and probably high carbon prices. and then identify what are the reforms, institutional changes that are needed, identify the investment and financing needs. And this should be the basis for designing our green growth strategy and carbon pricing, which the government is currently in the midst of doing that. So all of you, we hope as stakeholders, can provide the input. And today we will be hearing a lot more about carbon pricing and the role of CBAM as an external tool to really help us move forward. And the important thing, just as a final concluding point, when you talk about policy, what's the need for policy? It's one thing to design all these policies, but really the challenge, the main challenge, not for us, but also for many other countries, is coordination, given that this is really interagency and multi-stakeholder. How to get there? We really need carbon pricing reform to be linked to the overall growth strategy and not just be targets, but also how to implement, yeah? And making sure that it's a just, inclusive, and action-oriented implementation process. So let me close there and hope that we will have a good discussion. And it's not, today is the beginning of many discussions, I'm sure. And we will continue to have discussions with you, because this is, climate transition is everybody's business and everybody's collective interest. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ibu Mari, for the very insightful presentation and for setting the scene for our discussion today. Without further ado, it is now time for the main event for today, which is the public lecture by Professor Catherine Wolfram, the William Barton Rogers Professor of Energy Economics, MIT Sloan School of Management. And I would like to invite Mr. Ardhi Wardhana, researcher at the Department of Economics, CSIS Indonesia, to moderate the session. Mas Ardhi, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much for your attendance today. Distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends, welcome to today's DfD lecture at the CSIS Indonesia. We are honored to have the opportunity to listen to Professor Mari Elka Pangestu as the Special Presidential Envoy for the International Trade and Multilateral Cooperation and Vice Chairman of the National Economic Council of Indonesia. And also, we will listen to and discuss with Professor Catherine Wolfram, the William Barton Rogers Professor of Energy Economics from the MIT. And before that role, she was the Cora Jane Flood Professor at UC Berkeley. Aside from her academic role, between early 2021 and the end of 2022, she served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate and Energy Economics at the US Treasury. Professor Wolfram is one of the foremost scholars at the intersection of climate, energy, and trade, including work on oil, market sanctions, and carbon pricing. Please welcome Professor Wolfram with enthusiastic applause. How are you today?
Great, thank you for having me.
All right, thank you very much for coming all the way from the US, and we'd love to hear from you about how do developing economies strategically respond to mechanisms like the EU carbon border adjustment or the UK or any other BCA in the world, and the shifting climate policies globally. And yeah, I know that you are all very, very excited to listen to Professor Wolfram. So without any further ado, let's begin the lecture. Please, the podium is you all.
Wonderful. Terima kasih. I'm very glad to be here and thrilled to be talking to you about this important topic. So over the long weekend in the US, the 4th of July was on Friday. Unfortunately, we all got news about a devastating flood in northern Texas that has probably killed more than 80 people. So I think that's just another indication of the changing weather patterns that we're all experiencing and the devastation that that's bringing to us. And so the extreme importance of talking about climate and both how we mitigate it, which we'll be talking about today, but also how we adapt to it, because no matter how much mitigation we do, there's still going to be some changing climate impacts, and so we'll need to learn how to deal with them. So I wanted to start by explaining the background that I bring to thinking about these topics. And as Ardhi mentioned, I served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate and Energy at the US Treasury in the beginning of the Biden administration under Janet Yellen. And I took this picture on my iPhone basically from right underneath my office at the time. And I would get to my office by basically walking down this path right next to the White House. And so I have all these pictures on my phone of the White House, like here in the fall colors, the White House in the freshly fallen snow, the White House in kind of the new spring greenery. And so I found it very inspiring every day to walk to work right next to the White House. And I raise this, both as an indication of part of the policy angle that I'll bring to this conversation, but also as hopefully an inspiration to people out there to pursue government policy positions. I really found it, extremely inspiring to be part of the policy discussions that we were having at the time. And I think it's really important for conversations like the one that we'll have today, where civil society, academics are helping to try to inform policymakers. So I took this in November of 2021, which was kind of halfway through, or a little bit less than halfway through my tenure there. But the beginning of the work that I was doing on the sanctions on Russia. So, the US was seeing evidence that Russia was amassing troops on the border of Ukraine around this time. And as an energy person, we were starting to think about the potential impacts of an invasion on energy prices. So in the, right after the invasion, I started working on what became the price cap on Russian oil. And actually, in the summer of 2022, I took my first trip to Jakarta as part of a delegation from the US Treasury to begin talking to our counterparts in Indonesia about potential responses to the sanctions that we were planning at that point. So I bring this up partly because, for me, this was a very influential piece of my career to really see kind of a policy idea go from implementation and I wrote one of the original memos on the price cap on Russian oil, and then 2.5 months later the G7 leaders were announcing that this was something that they were pursuing. And so the idea was not mine. In fact, it was inspired by an idea from Ricardo Hausmann, who I understand was a previous speaker here. And so again, I think that's an indication of the importance of academics and civil society kind of lobbing ideas into the policy sphere. But the second reason that I bring this up is because in my experience with the sanctions, the U.S. was a leader. I mean, the U.S. decided that this was what we wanted to do with Russian oil, that we wanted to put a price cap. The U.S. kind of showed up to the G7, said, here's what we want to do. And, the U.S. was able to marshal the forces and get this implemented. But unfortunately, with climate, I think that President Trump has made it very, very clear that the U.S. is not going to be a leader in climate. And the U.S. is, in fact, withdrawing from all climate discussions. And so I think that this is really going to make it clear to countries in the rest of the world that they can't rely on U.S. leadership for climate, although climate is this, massive international coordination problem. So they need to figure out other leaders. They need to figure out other ways to move forward without the U.S. And so that's going to be the topic of my talk. What I want to start with doing is just highlighting the ways in which Trump has made it clear that the U.S. is not a leader here. But I think that an encouraging development is that the EU has introduced this the policy, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, that I hope I will convince you really confronts one of the fundamental issues associated with climate change in a way that no previous policy has. The CBAM, for that reason, I think is a very encouraging development, but the third part of my talk will be thinking about the potential impacts of the CBAM on low and middle income countries. And I hope I'll convince you that it's not all bad for low and middle income countries, that there are some countries that we think and our research shows could in fact benefit from the CBAM. So kind of drawing on the momentum that I think the CBAM is bringing to the climate policy discussions, I'm going to discuss a proposal that I have with a working group that Ibu Mari is part of for a heavy industry climate coalition. And I'll conclude by some thoughts on whether this is something that President Trump's kind of chaos in the global kind of trade, global climate markets will help or whether it will hurt. And so we can have a conversation about that, hopefully in the Q&A. Okay, so what's going on with U.S. climate policy in Trump's second term? Trump, campaigned on the idea that he would take the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Agreement on day one. He did that. He has also taken administrative steps to undo a lot of the progress that was made during the Biden administration, for instance, on regulations on methane emissions from oil and gas, on regulations on tailpipe emissions, so those would affect the deployment of electric vehicles, on regulations that the Biden administration had proposed on power plant emissions. The Trump administration has undone that. Just about a week ago, the U.S. Congress passed a bill that undid much of the Inflation Reduction Act and many of the subsidies for solar, wind, clean energy deployments that were built into that. I've had this slide in previous conversations and previous talks, and I didn't have done next to all those. I had like medium probability, but now all of these things have happened. I think that the thing that is worrying to a lot of my legal friends and legal scholars is that in addition to undoing the regulations that the Biden administration put, that the Trump administration will try to go after what's called the endangerment finding, which is kind of the legal basis for any type of climate regulation. So not only will he make it not only will he take away the Biden administration regulations, but he will make it harder for any future Democratic administration to enact climate-based regulations. So from a U.S. perspective, Trump is very much taking the U.S. kind of out of the climate game and reversing a lot of the progress that was made during the Biden administration. What I will argue, though, is that I think it's kind of important for Trump to send this very clear, very unambiguous message that the U.S. is not a climate leader and is not, really not part of the climate policy discussions and is erasing all climate policy in the U.S., removing itself from the international conversations, because I think that the U.S. climate policies were already very challenging. And let me explain one piece of evidence for that. So here's a map from the World Bank that shows in color the countries that have some form of carbon pricing. There's kind of a glass half empty way of looking at this map and to suggest that both there are a lot of countries that don't have carbon pricing and those countries that do, the carbon prices are quite low, as Ibu Mari presented in her conversation, or her slides. But the other way to look at this is the glass half full, which is to say there are a lot of countries that have some form of carbon price. And so if you look closely at this, the countries that are colored are the ones that have a carbon price. You don't have to worry about the different shades of the colors. And so closely, 17 out of the 20 G20 countries or jurisdictions have a carbon price. And the 3 that don't are Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the US. So it kind of seems like the US is in the category of Russia and Saudi Arabia, that the US is behaving and acting like a petrostate, essentially. So I would argue that already this should suggest that the US is different, that the US climate politics were challenging even before Trump came into office, that 17 of the other countries had managed to pass legislation, had managed to introduce carbon pricing, while the US had not. So why might carbon pricing in particular be challenging in the US? I think there are a couple theories about this. I think this is definitely something where there's need for more research. But on the one hand, and this is something that has changed a lot over the last 10 years, it's worth kind of highlighting the first fact here. The US is now the largest oil and the largest gas producer in the world. We surpassed Saudi Arabia in terms of oil production. We are a huge, huge gas producer because of the fracking revolution. And put this together with the second point on the list, that in the US, money plays an important role in politics. So that the huge, huge amounts of money that are supporting a large share of the US economy, that the large oil and gas producers, those are influencing US politics in a way that Chinese politics, that Indian politics, that countries that aren't as large oil and gas producers, it's not the same. The third point is that the US politics have become very, very polarized recently. And I learned while I was in government that not only does the right kind of not believe in climate change and not want to do anything to address climate change, but the left, even though they very fervently believe that climate change should be addressed, they hate carbon pricing. They really don't like the idea of carbon pricing. So carbon pricing is kind of a more centrist approach to addressing climate change, and one that the left in the US is not at all in favor of. So the more polarization we get, the less likely we are to get carbon pricing. Lastly, I think the fact that the US is part of, or has the status of being the reserve currency, that lets us borrow at very low interest rates, that imposes less fiscal discipline, as we've seen with the big, beautiful bill that was just passed. That increased our deficit a lot. So things that require money, like subsidies, are more attractive in the US than climate policies that bring in money, like carbon pricing. So for those reasons, I think it's important to realize that even with Democratic administrations, even without Trump, the US is different, and that climate policies are going to be different in the US. So this was an article that came out last month in the Foreign Affairs. It was not necessarily about climate politics, but I think it kind of highlights this idea that the US is in the same category as Russia and Saudi Arabia. It's calling the US a petrostate, and thinking about all the ways in which this is influencing US trade policy, kind of US thoughts about security issues. More than that, Trump has already been kind of turning his back on multilateral issues. We're definitely seeing this with tariffs. Tariffs are clearly in violation of WTO principles. They're clearly in violation of existing trade treaties that the US has. Another example of Trump turning his back on multilateralism is in the context of defense. Trump has been pretty kind of antagonistic towards NATO and really pushing the European countries to invest themselves in defense. And this whole idea of America first, that's really turning your back on other countries and turning your back on thinking about multilateral approaches to problems. So, as I said, I think this makes it very, very clear to the world that the US is not going to be a leader in climate policy, and that US climate policy, climate politics in the US around climate have been challenging for a long time, and will be challenging even if we have a Democratic administration in the future. So I think the key question for other countries is to think about how to move forward without the US. and how to move forward without thinking about ways that we can eventually drive the U.S. to get to the right decisions. For instance, by incentivizing U.S. industries to really see investing in a green transition as part of a growth strategy there. So I think that this leaves us in a situation where the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism is in fact particularly valuable. So I next want to talk about what the EU CBAM is and how I think it will help create potentially this virtuous policy cycle. Okay, so hopefully people in here have heard of the prisoner's dilemma. I don't know, maybe raise your hand if you're an economist, if you've heard of the prisoner's dilemma. A couple people there, so maybe I'll go through this a little bit slowly. The prisoner's dilemma is kind of an idea in game theory that applies to lots of different scenarios and basically emphasizes that individual actors making decisions will get us to a point that's bad collectively. So let me explain why I think that climate change is a kind of key example of the prisoner's dilemma. So in game theory, to simplify things, sometimes we think about just kind of two players. Here I have one player being the US making decisions about how much climate mitigation to do, and the rest of the world making decisions about how much climate mitigation to do. And they only have two choices. The choices are that they can do a little on climate mitigation or they can do a lot. So this is just kind of trying to simplify things and get it into the context of a simple prisoner's dilemma. So when I teach this to MBAs, a colleague of mine likes to use these icons to reflect kind of the way that the US, in this case, feels about the different combinations of choices. So for instance, this red frowny face, let's see if this works. Okay, so the red frowny face in the bottom left there is how the US feels if it decides to do a lot of climate mitigation and the rest of the world decides to do a little. That's, in this simple 2x2 framework, that's like the worst possible outcome, where the US is like spending a lot of money in subsidies or spending a lot of political capital, imposing a carbon price. It's doing a lot of work, and the rest of the world's doing a little. Since the US is only about 10% of global emissions, even if it's doing a lot on climate change and the rest of the world is doing a little, it's going to incur those costs, but it's not going to be making much progress on climate change. So that's why we've got that big kind of red frowny face. That's the worst possible outcome. Compare that to the box in the upper right. That's when the US is doing a little and the rest of the world is doing a lot. That's the best possible outcome. The US is only 10% of the global emissions, even if they're not doing very much, and if the rest of the world is doing a lot, we're going to experience fewer floods. Things will be great or better in terms of climate, and the US is not experiencing any of the costs associated with implementing the policies. So kind of second worst is to do a little while the rest of the world is doing a little, because then we're not addressing climate change. Second best is in the bottom right there, to have everyone doing a lot. So people understand how I've got those arranged? We'll have similar payoffs. So what I've introduced now are the payoffs for the rest of the world. And they're the same. If the US is doing a little and the rest of the world is doing a lot, that's the big red frowny face. And so now what you can do is you can think about, okay, if I'm the US and I know that the rest of the world is going to be doing a little, what's my choice? I'm deciding whether to do a lot, that's the big red frowny face, or do a little. That's not quite as bad, but it's better. So I'm going to do a little. Say I know that the rest of the world is going to do a lot. Then I'm deciding between doing a little while the rest of the world is doing a lot, that's great, or doing a lot while the rest of the world is doing a lot, that's kind of second best. So no matter what the rest of the world is going to do, the US is deciding to do a little. If you go through and solve out, if you make the comparisons for the rest of the world, it faces the same set of comparisons. And so you end up in this equilibrium where everyone is doing a little. And part of the problem is what economists call the free rider problem. Part of the problem is these smiley faces. So remember the upper right box where the US knows that the rest of the world is doing a lot. Its choice is to do a little. Its choice in econ terms is to what's called free ride. It knows that the rest of the world is basically addressing climate change. It's kind of small relative to the rest of the world, and so it can free ride on decisions that the rest of the world is making. And unfortunately, this is an incentive that every country faces. Every country, even more than the US, is a small part of the overall climate problem. And so why does it want to invest a lot of costs in mitigating climate? It just wants to rely on the rest of the world to do things. And so unfortunately, we are seeing this play out. We're seeing that the world is not making enough progress on climate change. Countries are, either committing to NDCs and then not achieving those NDCs, or committing to NDCs that aren't very ambitious. We are seeing this free riding play out in real terms. And so I will, argue that a key part of that is those smiley faces, is the fact that if you're a small part of the overall climate problem, you want the rest of the world to take care of the climate problem. And if every country faces those incentives, then we're left in this bad equilibrium, this bad outcome where we're not doing enough on climate change. So I think that in ways that no other policy before it has done, the EU CBAM addresses that free rider problem and basically makes it harder for a country to free ride on the rest of the world. So let me explain why I think that's the case. First of all, I'll explain what the CBAM is. So it's basically, as the name suggests, it's adjusting at the border for countries that are trying to export to the European Union, and it's charging them a carbon price equivalent to what the carbon price is in the European Union. So take the little icon on the right here. Imagine that the European Union carbon price is 75 euros per ton. So what this is saying is that if you're, say, imagine that icon is a steel producer. If you're a steel producer in the European Union, for every ton that you emit associated with making, ton of CO2 you emit associated with making your steel, you're paying 75 euros per ton. So with the CBAM, and it starts with the 5 industries listed in the box there, now every country that's exporting to the European Union has to pay that same border adjustment proportional to the carbon emissions that they used in making their steel or aluminum. So imagine that you're a steel producer in Malaysia. If it takes you 2 tons of CO2 to make 1 ton of steel, then every time you export to the European Union your steel, you have to pay 150 euros per ton. 2 tons of CO2 times that 75 euros per ton. Unless you have already paid a carbon price domestically. So in this example, imagine that Malaysian steel plant had already paid 10 euros per ton domestically to Malaysia, then it only has to pay 65. It gets credited for the 10 euros that it's already paid in Malaysia. So this component of CBAM is really kind of helping other countries think about the importance of carbon pricing. So for instance, take the case of Turkey. Turkey exports is there a question? Okay, so Turkey exports about 50% of their total manufacturing to the European Union. So Turkey is kind of doing this calculation, has done this calculation, and saying, my industry is already paying a carbon price for that 50% that's getting exported to the European Union, but my industry is basically writing a check for 75 euros per ton and sending it to Brussels. If we put on a carbon price domestically, our industry isn't going to complain because they're already paying the carbon price, but we get to keep the revenue. and will be credited, our industry will be credited with that carbon price that they've paid domestically when they export to the European Union. And so for Turkey, it's really kind of a fiscal calculus. They get to keep the revenue and not have their industry send it to the European Union. So that kind of logic has kind of led to a global conversation about carbon pricing. And if you go back to my prisoner's dilemma example, what that has done is changed the boxes that were particularly problematic. It's changed the free rider incentive. So I've left blank the payoff that the US gets if it decides to do a little while the rest of the world does a lot. Before, that was a big smiley face. The US wanted to be in that situation. But with the CBAM, if the US is one of the only countries that doesn't have carbon pricing, imagine Canada, Mexico have carbon pricing and CBAMs, then the US is in the same position as Turkey. It's kind of silly, right? Its industry is paying the carbon price every time it exports to the EU, the UK, Canada, Mexico, but they're sending checks to Mexico City and Ottawa and not paying the US. And so in that case, I would say that doing a little while the rest of the world is doing a lot gives you a negative outcome. It gives you this red frowny faces. It basically kind of cuts off the incentive to free ride on other countries. Because if you're one of the only countries left not doing carbon pricing, every time you try to export, you're facing these carbon border adjustment mechanisms. And so that leaves us in a position, it's called a coordination game. There are two equilibrium in this game, but it's a lot easier to solve a coordination game and decide to coordinate on doing a lot than it is to solve the free rider problem or to address the prisoner's dilemma. And so, as I said, I think, we've had climate policies, we've had 30 years of COPs, we have lots of discussions, but to date, no other policies have really confronted the free rider problem in the same way that the CBAM has. And so I think the CBAM is this potentially really transformative climate policy and one that can kickstart a positive feedback cycle like we discussed with Turkey. So some evidence that this is happening, this is from a policy brief that I have with some colleagues at Resources for the Future. This is looking at the number of other countries since the EU started talking about CBAM that have either implemented a carbon price in red or are at some phase of the conversation about carbon pricing. And you'll see that in January 2019, when the EU first started talking about the CBAM, I think there were like 57 countries that had carbon prices. But since then, there's just been this rapid increase in the number of countries that are either implementing or talking about carbon pricing. So we don't know that this is because of the CBAM, but some further research that we did really looks at exactly when the EU started talking about the CBAM. You see this explosion in the number of mentions of carbon pricing and carbon border adjustment mechanisms in newspapers around the world. So I think that it suggests that this has really started a global conversation about carbon pricing. So that's good. I think addressing the free rider problem, undoing the prisoner's dilemma in climate policy, that's super important. But the CBAM definitely has some challenges. So let me talk about those next. Okay, I think one of the primary challenges is that there are concerns about the impacts that CBAM will have on low and middle income countries. I've highlighted here a couple of headlines from the global press, but basically, every week that you look at the global press, you can find headlines like this. So for instance, South Africa is saying that they may challenge the CBAM policy before the WTO. They think that the EU carbon tax is just not just. One of the phrases that I've heard describing the CBAM is that it's a form of regulatory colonialism. It's basically the EU deciding what should be done about carbon pricing, or sorry, about climate policy, suggesting that it should be carbon pricing, and not only that, suggesting exactly what the carbon price should be, right? You know, even if the Malaysian steel plant, in my example, had a carbon price of 30, they would still have to pay that difference and make up to get to the EU carbon price. So I think that part of the allegation of regulatory colonialism is assuming that the CBAM will have negative impacts on the economies of low and middle income countries. One example of that is this report from the Center for Global Development, where they concluded that Mozambique, because they are a very large exporter of aluminum, and because most of their aluminum goes to the European Union, the CGD concluded that about 1.6% of Mozambique's GDP would be at risk because of the CBAM. So I disagree with that, and I hope I'll convince you that in order to really understand what the CBAM is doing, we need places like CSIS to do kind of careful, data-driven analyses of the CBAM. So I think part of that assumption that the CBAM is bad for low and middle income countries is based on this idea that low and middle income countries have kind of dirtier production, that the production maybe isn't at the technological frontier, and therefore they will be particularly hurt by the CBAM. But in some research that I've done with co-authors, we've looked at basically the emissions intensity as a function of a country's GDP per capita. And so this idea that the low and middle income countries are particularly dirty would suggest that the line is downward sloping. We see that a bit in aluminum, but if you look at the statistical significance, you know, it's not even statistically significantly downward sloping. So for instance, these are bins of countries, you know, we've kind of binned them so that there are 20 dots on the graph. But Mozambique is an example of a country that's below the line. Mozambique is an example of a country that is very low income, but also quite clean in the way it produces aluminum. We see in general with steel that the line isn't even downward sloping, that on average, low-income countries are cleaner than high-income countries. But again, it's quite noisy, and it varies country by country. So, you know, one example of how countries are getting information about what the impact of the CBAM might be is this World Bank product that's called the CBAM Exposure Index. So part of the reason that I'm highlighting Mozambique is because they show up on this CBAM Exposure Index as, you know, one of two countries, Ukraine is the other countries, that is particularly exposed to CBAM, and particularly as the World Bank calculates it, going to be negatively affected by CBAM. The more orange colors are more negatively affected, the more green colors are positively affected. So in general, the World Bank is calculating that most other countries will be negatively affected by CBAM, and Mozambique in particular, because it's kind of bright orange, will be negatively affected. But in the work that we've done, and we've had kind of ongoing conversations with the World Bank about their data, we suspect that the data that the World Bank is using is both kind of older, not up to date, and things are changing rapidly in terms of the green transition and decarbonization of industry, and they are not very granular. So they are making assumptions about Mozambique's production capabilities that are not grounded in data and are kind of reflective are not grounded in very granular data and reflect averaging in a way that in this case makes it look like the CBAM is detrimental for Mozambique. So what we've done, and we're working with the government of Mozambique here, we've collected very, very detailed data on the aluminum sector. We've got 153, every primary aluminum smelter in the world. And what we've done is kind of arrange them from lowest cost to highest cost and accumulated them up here. If you're from an econ perspective or from an econ background, this is basically a supply curve for aluminum. And Mozal, the primary aluminum producer in Mozambique, even before you account for carbon costs, Mozal is relatively cost competitive. It's There's a huge hydroelectric plant in Mozambique. That's basically why they build an aluminum smelter, because they have access to this cheap power. So Mozal is quite cost competitive. Once you add carbon pricing, Mozal becomes even more cost competitive, because yes, Mozal's costs go up. There are some carbon emissions associated with primary aluminum smelting, even if you're getting the electricity from a completely clean producer. So Mozal's cost will go up. That's the difference between the gray line there and the black line. But Mozal's costs go up by a lot less than most of the other aluminum smelters in the world. And so you can see, that gray line has shifted to the left, to the red line. If you do it in terms of percentiles, on the left, before accounting for carbon costs, Mozal was cheaper than about 80% of the plants. Once you start accounting for carbon costs, Mozal becomes cheaper than 92% of the carbon of the plants in the world. And so this is an indication that yes, Mozal's costs go up because they have to pay for carbon, but what really matters is how Mozal's costs compare to its competitors. So why am I saying that? Actually, sorry. First, I think this is a strong case for doing independent data analysis. And again, this is another plug for organizations like CSIS. I think it's important for individual countries not to necessarily rely on the World Bank. The World Bank's data are kind of indicative, but you want to understand at a granular level how your industries will be affected by something like the CBAM. So in kind of simple economic terms, let me explain what we think is going to happen once the CBAM is in place. So basically, before the CBAM was in place, you could think about the aluminum market as just being a global market. There was one price for aluminum that was essentially consistent around the world. In some parts of the world, like the US, there were tariffs, so this is a bit of an abstraction, but aluminum is a commodity. It's an element on the periodic table. Aluminum blocks made in Mozambique are the same as aluminum blocks made in China. It's basically a commodity. What we're doing is kind of separating the rest of the world from the European Union, because once the CBAM comes into effect, they will be different markets. But before the CBAM, there was one world price, and there were kind of supply and demand curves in the EU and in the rest of the world. So once the CBAM comes into effect, what this does in the European market is adds this additional cost. And so we've reflected that by the supply curve rotating from the black curve to the green curve. And that's the same as what I showed you before with the supply curve that we built, that once you add carbon as an additional cost to making aluminum, it becomes more expensive. So what that means is that suppliers in the EU market will get what you can think of as basically a green premium to supplying into that market, while suppliers in the rest of the world will get a brown discount. So the price in the rest of the world will be a little bit lower than it is in the European Union. What matters for Mozambique then is whether it gets priced out of the European market, whether its costs go up by a lot and it's too expensive for it to supply into the European market, and it now has to supply into the rest of the world with that brown discount, or whether it can remain competitive in the EU and earn that green premium. And so what we see based on the data that I just showed you is that Mozambique is actually pretty cost competitive. Because Mozambique's carbon emissions are lower than in the rest of the world, it remains cost competitive. Maybe it even wants to expand production of aluminum because it's got this nice, clean source of electricity. And its aluminum is going to add that green, is going to earn that green premium. So to us, this suggests that once you get kind of granular data, once you think through the economics of how the market might change, this suggests that Mozambique will benefit from the CBAM. That rather than having that big orange, color on the World Bank market or on the World Bank map, we think that Mozambique stands to benefit from the CBAM. In the conversations that we're having with the Mozambique government, we have tried to encourage them to implement a carbon price on the aluminum sector. And again, because our analysis suggests that it will be a boon to them to supply into the European market, their industry, Mosal, isn't going to object to paying the carbon price. They're going to be paying it in any case. And Mozambique, as a very poor country, exports about 99%, the large share of its aluminum is exported. And so basically, Mosal has this choice: do I pay the check to Brussels, or I pay the check locally in Maputo in Mozambique? They don't care. It's money out of their pocket one way or the other. But for the Mozambique government, it's a big source of revenue potentially. Just this carbon tax on one supplier. Okay. So with that in mind, we think, CBAM is solving this prisoner's dilemma problem, encouraging lots of countries to think about carbon pricing, and B, isn't necessarily bad for countries like Mozambique, countries that have clean production in some of the CBAM sectors. And so together with a number of thought leaders from around the world, including Ibu Mari, we've started thinking about, is there a way to address some of the objections to CBAM, but use continued using the benefits of CBAM and tapping into this kind of policy spillover or virtuous policy feedback cycle. So about 8 days ago, we put out an interim report reflecting kind of the chair's perspective on the working group conversations that we've had about a climate coalition. The working group includes 19 thought leaders from around the world. We have somebody from Canada. Canada recently elected a new prime minister who campaigned on the idea of a carbon border adjustment mechanism. It includes thought leaders from India, thought leaders from China, thought leaders from many parts of the world. And we're trying to think about what a climate coalition might look like that both centers on carbon pricing, takes advantage of that map that I showed you where a lot of countries are already implementing carbon pricing, but then tries to address some of the objections to the CBAM and tries to do things in a slightly fairer way. So we are outlining what a coalition might look like and trying to kind of present this to policymakers to help them think about what a coalition that centers on carbon pricing might look like. We're presenting a couple of different ways in which the coalition could implement carbon pricing. One is to have basically a uniform carbon price floor. And so basically everyone in the coalition would agree to have a carbon price floor of, the way we're modeling it, is say 50 euros per ton. Another alternative is to have what we're calling a graduated carbon price, where high-income countries would agree to have a carbon price floor of 75 euros per ton, or $75, I think we modeled it in dollars. Upper middle-income countries would agree to have a carbon price floor of 50 dollars per ton, and low middle-income countries would agree to have a $25 per ton carbon price. So the way that would work is that countries, low and middle income countries, would get credit when they exported to high income countries at 3 times whatever they paid. So if they had already paid a carbon price of $25 per ton, they would have no border adjustment to pay if the EU price was at 75. And so we think that this might be a way to kind of keep the CBAM, keep the policy momentum for carbon pricing alive, but recognize the concept of common but differentiated responsibilities. Basically, let low-income countries into the coalition at a lower carbon price than high-income countries. So with this, we've done some preliminary modeling. We think having a coalition is important for a couple of reasons. One is that you get many more carbon reductions than with just the EU CBAM. The second one, and we think that this has been kind of undervalued in the conversations about carbon pricing, is that by implementing carbon prices, countries earn fiscal revenues. And so the calculations that we've done suggest, remember I was talking about Mozambique. If Mozambique imposes a $50 per ton carbon price on Mosal, on this one taxable entity, it's a pretty easy tax to implement. Mosal isn't going to complain about it. They increase their total fiscal revenues by 1%. So that's, a significant amount of money that Mozambique can then spend on healthcare, on education, could spend on climate adaptation. It's basically up to the country to decide how it can spend the money. Similarly, if you look at Indonesia, its carbon price revenue from a $50 per ton carbon price on just the sectors that are covered by the CBAM would bring in about $2 billion a year, or again, about 1% of the government's total revenue. So we think that this is an important consideration for countries to think about carbon pricing. We think there are some additional carrots that the coalition members might want to think about. One is to think about opportunities for technology transfer, possibly through the MDBs. You could think about, for instance, the high-income countries using a portion of their revenues and devoting it to a trust fund at the World Bank, and that trust fund would fund investments in decarbonization in low and middle-income countries related to decarbonization of steel or decarbonization of aluminum. You might also think about the removal of trade barriers to inputs to the clean technology developments in these sectors. Things like critical minerals have an agreement that coalition members will freely trade those inputs. Or you might even think about the high-income countries devoting some of their carbon price revenues to climate finance and helping to fund either investments in carbon mitigation or investment in climate adaptation. And again, I think recognizing that carbon pricing is a important source of fiscal revenue and an important source of fiscal revenue that could potentially be used for climate finance is an important part of that conversation. So let me just close by thinking about, will this happen? What are some of the incentives that different countries have to join such a climate coalition? We think from the perspective of the EU, it basically helps provide momentum, provide an impetus for the continuation of the CBAM, helps prevent objections that countries might bring to the CBAM at the WTO. And I think it also helps protect some of their downstream consumers. So right now, if you're an auto producer in the EU, you're not that happy about that green premium on aluminum because that's an increase in the cost to your production. But if there's a climate coalition, if, imagine Japan is part of the climate coalition, then Japanese automakers will also pay a green premium for their aluminum. And so that makes it more attractive for the important industrial constituents within the European Union. Why might China join such a climate coalition? And let me just emphasize, China is an extremely important part of a climate coalition in these sectors in particular. China is about 50% of the global steel production, about 60% of the global aluminum production, and so they are an extremely important part. If you look back at the fiscal revenues, you'll see the Chinese fiscal revenues from a carbon price are quite high, reflecting that. So why might they be interested in being part of such a climate coalition? If you go with a graduated carbon price, then China will get exemption from the EU CBAM at a lower price. So this is an exemption that might be valuable for them. It also, from a more geopolitical perspective, that one conjecture is that China might be interested in multilateralism, particularly multilateralism that excludes the US. In some of these trade conversations, my perception has been that China kind of likes to take the position of the adult in the world, the adult that's kind of supporting multilateralism, where the U.S. is being the kind of whatever toddler in the world and having temper tantrums around multilateralism. Lastly, China has invested so heavily in the clean energy transition. So China recently expanded its emissions trading system to cover the steel industry, the aluminum industry, and the cement industry. My theory is that China has done that because they are also making heavy investments in the decarbonization of those industries. And so if they are leading in the decarbonization of those industries, they might like something that encourages other countries to want to buy electrolyzers. And if China becomes a huge producer of electrolyzers, that's a good outcome for them. So lastly, I've thought about some of the incentives for Indonesia to join such a climate coalition. Of course, I would like to hear the conversation about this, whether this is the right set of incentives. Again, like China, they would get exemption from the CBAM at a lower price. This is just a reminder, the EU CBAM is the EU law. It seems like it will go into effect next year. With that in mind, thinking about ways to incentivize cooperation that are slightly more advantageous to countries like Indonesia might be a way to get countries to join a coalition. Also, if the coalition adopts some of the recommendations about climate finance, like the trust fund set up at the World Bank, then Indonesia would get access to the climate finance. And lastly, I haven't emphasized this, but there's a lot of consternation about the reporting requirements that will be enacted under the CBAM. We think if a coalition of countries gets together, they could think kind of constructively about what those reporting requirements should be. And so Indonesia, as part of the coalition, would be able to participate in those discussions, would be able to help shape what the reporting requirements could be. And I think as conversations about carbon pricing, about CBAMs proliferate, there is, without a coalition, there's the risk that we'll get like Australia's CBAM, and there will be one set of reporting requirements for Australia's, there'll be a UK CBAM, another set of reporting requirements there, there'll be just these reporting and administrative costs that companies will have to face. If we have a coalition, we can kind of unify the measurement, reporting, and verification standards. So does this make sense? Does multilateralism or minilateralism, we're thinking about the climate coalition, eventually expanding to include most of the world, but in the beginning, potentially including a small number of countries, maybe Brazil, EU, Canada, China, Indonesia. It's not many countries. It's a big share of emissions, so a lot of emission reductions. But do the trade tensions that the U.S. is creating make a coalition like this more or less attractive? I have thoughts on both sides, and again, curious to hear about this in the question and answer. Curious to hear whether you agree. What I think makes it more likely to happen is that this coalition would provide kind of strength in numbers. Right now, as we're seeing, Trump would ideally like to have bilateral conversations with every single country. The U.S. is a big consumer. If it takes on Indonesia, Vietnam separately, it can negotiate a pretty good deal. Whereas if countries band together, if they are all part of a climate coalition, and the climate coalition has decided this is the way we are going to trade steel and aluminum. There's going to be a border adjustment that reflects the carbon intensity. Maybe that border adjustment will reflect a graduated carbon price. Then it's harder for Trump to individually negotiate separate deals with countries. I think that this provides kind of as I say, kind of strength in numbers. And secondly, as I highlighted with the Chinese potential incentives to join the coalition, other countries may want to protect multilateralism. Multilateralism has a lot of benefits. There may be countries that want to kind of step up to the plate and counteract Trump's, just kind of America first, blowing up the multilateralism. On the other hand, I do think that there's fear of rocking the boat. The U.S. is a very large consumer. I think countries might fear that if they join such a climate coalition, that this will be yet another thing that Trump is angry about, not yet another issue to have to deal with in these trade negotiations. That said, this is kind of a technical issue, to be honest. And so, like CBAM, it's this wacky acronym that no one's ever heard about. It's kind of complicated. I think there's an opportunity for at least a technocratic discussion about this, to kind of fly under the radar, to establish the basis, the intellectual underpinnings for such a climate coalition. And hopefully in 2028, 2029, the US will be kind of more sensitive to the importance of such a climate coalition, and the technocrats will have done had the conversations to get this going. So just to conclude, I think that countries have a lot to gain from coordinating on carbon pricing approaches. When I listed the incentives for countries to join the climate coalition, notice that I didn't include what is the biggest incentive, which is we would get lots of emission reductions. So that, I think that's important to emphasize. I think that this climate coalition, as we said, focuses initially on the heavy industries, initially on the CBAM sectors. But it's my personal view if we get the finance ministries from a couple of countries, like the countries I mentioned, talking about climate policies, talking about ways to incentivize other countries to pursue aggressive climate policies, that conversation can expand to other sectors and have benefits beyond just the heavy industries. That said, the heavy industries that we are going to focus on might seem like it's just like 3 or 4 sectors, but they are 20% of global emissions. Steel is an incredibly carbon-intensive production process. Aluminum is very carbon-intensive. So just those sectors alone, having a conversation about them would be extremely important. And as we've emphasized with the Mozambique example, a world that prices carbon is not necessarily one that is bad for low and middle income countries. It's definitely one that prioritizes clean production. To the extent countries like Indonesia have access to a lot of geothermal production, a lot of hydro production, this is something that they can leverage as a competitive advantage and leverage as part of a green growth strategy. So hopefully I've said enough provocative things to get a lot of conversation going in the discussion, but I look forward to the questions. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Wolfram, for that sharp and thought-provoking, I would say, presentation. And just to sum up, you situated the CBAM within the broader global geopolitical context, which is very, very a great conversation that you start with. And you argue that the CBAM could catalyze a virtuous cycle of climate cooperation, but only if low and middle income countries are meaningfully included. And more importantly, you also proposed a formation of multilateral climate coalition, where developing countries, especially Indonesia and other developing countries, can coordinate on carbon pricing and benefit from lower carbon prices, technological transfer, and access to climate finance. All right, that just my 2 cents. It was your presentation reminded me when I was a student in Columbia University, and when I took a class from Professor Scott Barrett, and yeah, we also talk about the prisoner dilemma and etc., and also about the COP30 negotiation as well. And yeah, the one that I remember from the conversation in the class was like, about like if we channel the decarbonization through the trade, it might be incentivizing others to follow the decarbonization effort. But on the other hand, it has some trade-offs, sort of the retaliation and trade tension and etc. I was just curious, just to begin with first question, I was just curious about, do you think that this is a good time, because we know that the U.S. also has a Section 232 that includes aluminum, steel, if I'm not mistaken. So we did our modeling within the center, and we did the modeling, combine the CBAM and also the Section 232, and yeah, the intertwining impact is not really in a good shape, I would say. So do you think that like the CBAM, the EU CBAM that will be implemented next year and the UK CBAM that will be implemented the year after, do you think that during this global tension, this is the right time to do that or not? That might be my first question to begin with. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I do think that, as I emphasized, I think that carbon pricing was always going to be challenging in the U.S., but carbon pricing is such an important part of the world answer to climate change. So I think that in some ways taking the U.S. out of it lets other countries focus on or think about a climate coalition that is centered on carbon pricing. If the U.S. had been there, we've seen already with like the OECD that they're kind of doing backflips to try to include the U.S. in the conversation. And so they're coming up with things like equivalent carbon price that recognizes subsidies. But without the U.S. there, other countries can kind of zero in on carbon pricing. I think that's the optimistic view. The pessimistic view, as you said, is that the U.S. has introduced all this uncertainty and kind of friction in the global trade, specifically around some of these industries like aluminum and steel. So is this really a time when we want to think about additional changes to that market and additional changes that admittedly would antagonize President Trump? I think that's a really good question. I do think that there is kind of a strength in numbers argument. I think that Trump has tried with the U.S. universities, with the U.S. law firms. He has kind of revealed this strategy of wanting to do bilateral. He wants every law firm to come in and make concessions. What he doesn't want is the law firms to band together or the universities to band together and decide we are a coordinated group and we are going to challenge some of those requests. So I think in some ways this is like the country version. Like we are going to stand together as a set of countries and decide to have a principled conversation about what steel and aluminum trade should look like. Part of that principled conversation is we want to reflect the carbon emissions associated with steel and aluminum. So I think that's the argument for why now is the right time to have that conversation, but yeah.
All right, thank you very much. So we got plenty of time, and I'll open on the first round. I think I'll open 3 rounds, consisting of 3 questions. Wait a minute. Yeah, I know you're excited all. Consisting of 3 questions. And yeah, probably let's start now. Okay. Is there any female? Okay, probably start with you. And yeah, you and yes, please, in the back. I really encourage female to talk about this too, right? Okay, because our speakers today are all female. So yeah, I really encourage you.
Okay, thank you. My name, hello, good evening. Good evening, my name is Widianto from @connect.asia. I have, thank you for
From where? Sorry?
@connect.asia, itu Association Carbon Emission Expert. I have 2 questions. Innovating in the border carbon adjustment BCA process through the carbon border adjustment mechanism CBAM, which increasingly strict in the European Union and the United States. First question: what are the suggestions from Professor in complying with expensive global emission standards in maintaining the competitive on commodity export such as palm oil and steel in Indonesia? And the second question, what are examples of policy strategies that have been successfully implemented in developing countries other than Indonesia that could be adopted by Indonesia without causing significant negative impact on economic and social growth to be able to balance the obligation to mitigate climate change and the need to remain competitive in the global market? Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Widianto.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let us collect 3 questions first. Next, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Hiskia Tasik. I'm directing the Samratulangi University SD Center as well as advising APEC Sustainable Energy Center in China. I have a question for you. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's very interesting. And I'm so interested in one of your slides saying the incentives of the countries such as China to join the climate coalition. I'm just wondering though, what do you think? Like, are there any incentive for China to join the coalition with the condition right now? China actually is striving to be the best player in the world, not only in consumer products, but as well in energy production. Right now we know that China, I think, is the biggest producer of solar panels, and also they work hard adopting the energy from the wave, from the wind, and so on and so on. So I'm just wondering. I want to hear your opinions, your views. Right now, EU is implementing the CBAM and so on and so on. Other countries as well. Also, they try to regulate the related to climate issues. Don't you think that in near future, China is going to be the big regulator of climate? Maybe some years from now, I don't know, because they have like everything in terms of energy and so on and so on, and they have, for example, when we talk about the EU CBAM, China's biggest market is not actually countries in EU. If I'm not mistaken, only Germany is one of the countries that actually has the biggest market of China products. While China's biggest market is in the United States, in terms of electronics, retail products, consumer products, plastic, Indonesia is one of the biggest products of China. What do you think in the future? If, for example, if China becomes the biggest regulator of climate.
Please be concise, Pak.
Oh, yeah. If China becomes the biggest regulator of climate issues, what do you think? How should big countries like US and middle countries like Indonesia to adapt and to respond to that issue? Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Pak Hiskia. Last one, yes, please.
Hi, I'm Arya Gadu from University of Arkansas. So one thing that I'm wondering, I mean, this coalition really depends on everybody joining, right? And essentially, a CBAM would increase prices for producers. And if there are not enough players, then I'm trying to think about, have you sort of like think about implications when productions move to non-CBAM countries, which probably have lax sort of like environmental standards, and whether, what is there sort of like an optimal size of coalition which is necessary for this to actually be carbon reducing, given the potential sort of a reallocation of producers. That's it. Thanks.
All right. Thank you very much for the questions. All right, we have 3 questions here. Do you got all?
Sure.
All right, okay,
Yep.
thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for those questions. Let me try to take them in turn. First, there was the question about what countries can do to maintain competitiveness in the face of CBAM, and what are some successful policies that countries have adopted. I mean, I think the economic incentives are pretty straightforward. To maintain competitiveness, countries need to reduce emissions, countries need to invest in the green transition, countries need to decarbonize these sectors. As far as the successful policies to do those things, and let me just reinforce that the reason is because the CBAM is the amount of emissions times the carbon price, basically. So either a country can drive down its emissions, export green steel, green aluminum, and then even if it doesn't have a carbon price, because its emissions are so low, it's not paying a very big border adjustment. Or it can, you know, in addition, it could implement a carbon price, and then its country's exports are credited with that carbon price. So I think the successful policies are either to implement the carbon price, or, and again, these don't need to be mutually exclusive, invest in, you know, subsidies, kind of strategies, policies that will incentivize companies to decarbonize. So, you know, subsidies for clean steel, clean aluminum, those are things that, that potentially countries are thinking about, or strategies to like incentivize clean production that don't involve the subsidies. So some of those strategies might be like clean production, clean procurement. If the government as a big producer, government as a big consumer of these industries says, I'm only gonna buy clean aluminum, or I'm gonna favor clean aluminum in my procurement strategies. Those are potentially policies that don't cost as much as subsidies. The second question was about the incentives for China to join. So I guess the way I'm thinking about it is there are kind of 2 potential paths that the world can take. And just to make it like simple, think about the US path or the China path. US is basically trying to ignore climate change, and the US would like to go down the path where the world is consuming lots of fossil fuels, lots of oil, lots of natural gas, because the US is a big producer of those. Whereas China would prefer to have the world go down the path where we recognize climate change. And to do that, there needs to be government intervention, right? There needs to be some kind of climate policy. So as I interpreted your question, you were kind of saying, why does China want other countries to adopt climate policies, because then China will lose its competitive advantage? I think China wants other countries to adopt climate policies because it doesn't want us to go down the US path. It doesn't want countries to ignore climate change. That China has kind of made these investments, as you suggested, in becoming the largest solar producer, the largest producer of electric vehicles. But in order for those products to be demanded, like in order for those products to be what the world transitions to, there need to be climate policies. Because otherwise, we are stuck in the prisoner's dilemma. We're not going to do enough to address climate change, and we'll go down the US path, where we're kind of turning our backs on clean energy, electric vehicles, the things that China is really good at producing, and sticking to the US path.
On his second question about do you foresee
Don't forget your microphone.
China to be the big regulator of climate? Implementing CBAM or something?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would describe them as the big regulator, but they are definitely a big emitter. So, and this gets to the third question about, you know, what the optimal coalition size is, especially for these industries. I think it really does depend on China becoming part of the coalition, because they are such a large emitter and such a large producer in these industries.
Okay. All right. Do you already have a number, like how many now yet in the model?
So we are modeling it based on the thought leaders that are part of our
All right.
coalition, and we have people from China, we have people from
Okay.
India. I guess I would say that part of the incentive for this coalition is to think about processes to address climate change that are independent of the UN approach. That the UN approach has a lot of advantages. It gives every country a voice. It gives, you know, low-income countries a seat at the table. On the other hand, it requires there to be consensus between 195 countries. So there's this like lowest common denominator result that I think comes out of UN. So what we're trying to do is think about approaches that don't rely on consensus with 195 countries, that might just involve 5 or 6 of the large emitters around the world, like as I suggested, you know, Brazil, EU, China, Indonesia. That's only 5 countries, but a huge share of the global emissions.
All right, fantastic. All right, let's open the second round. Is there any question? All right, first one. 2 others? Yes, please. And, okay, you. All right, so 1, 2, and 3.
Hello, my name is Mutiara, and I'm interested in getting your point of view on how you envision.
Sorry, from where?
I'm just an independent party. I came from my friend's invitation.
All right, okay.
Yeah, I'm just interested in what you envision in the United States in a post-Trump world, where you mentioned where the polarizing policies that's happening now is going from one extreme to the other. So what do you think would happen, whether the next candidate will be a Democrat or Republican? How does that affect with the climate policies? And do you think, because you mentioned also that this is much more of a centrist idea that how it can flourish in that space. So what is the optimistic outcome, and what can we look for in the future if there's a positive change in that aspect? Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for the question. Next.
Thank you. Yudo from Universitas Islam International Indonesia. Thank you for really interesting and thought-provoking presentation. So, you know, like given the current situation that you mentioned, for me it's really hard to imagine the global coalitions or multilateralism without the US support. So, given that situation, I wonder whether this CBAM policy will last longer. I mean, like, is there any possibility that, let's say, the US might threaten, you know, this kind of policy? So I think this is really important because, you know, given what happens in recent weeks, recent months with the US trade policy. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Mas Yudo. And last one.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Very inspiring discussion. Actually, we have. Thank you, Professor.
Name, please.
My name is Alexander Ludi, and thank you also, founding fathers, Bu Mari Elka. I'm actually Digital Transformation Council from Ministry of Industry. I'm Vice Chairman, and I'm involved in the startup ecosystem, actually. I now remember back then when I worked for European Union, Brussels, Rue de la Loi 2000, when we built the first harmonization in pressure equipment directive, PED. I do remember we accept China as the delegation at that time, just to have to know a little bit about the European perspective. I think we are coming into the era of, let me say, isolations now instead of globalization. We have to be aware of. I think you can read from John Meshammer against Jeffrey Sachs' discussion is pretty clear. My question will be then, I involve also the AI Strategic National, and we refer to the EU AI Act, yeah, compared to the US or compared to the China, which is very restrictive. So in this position, Indonesia is quite open. Yeah. So we can be with China, we can be with US, with Europe. Now it's depending on how we deal with this. Of course, we need to lobby the European parliaments. That's my experience, 3 years in the European Union, of course. But again, how then we settle internally in Indonesia? We do have a very big archipelago. Do we have to settle in zone? Like this one is for supplying to the US, with the other one is supplying to Europe, while the other zone of industrial complex is supplying to China, for instance. And I do have experience recently. I don't have to mention which zona in the industry, but I got a great opposition from that zona of industry because it's coming from Japanese industrial zone. I cannot install any kind of electric vehicle coming from China, for instance. So it's pretty much straightforward. I think the approach, I love these discussions. And yeah, the solution, I think, is here in Indonesia because we do have this open ecosystem. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much, Pak Alexander. Okay, start with Mutiara.
Yeah, the post-Trump world. I think it's clear that I'm a Democrat, and I'm definitely counting the days until when we might get into that world. What that world looks like, I think 3.5 years is a long, long time. I think that there are a lot of potential scenarios that one could imagine. I don't know if you followed, but Elon Musk is now threatening to support a third party. One might think that that third party would be more centrist. I don't know if that third party will get any legs. You know, I think there's some chance that the Republicans, even in a post-Trump world, the Republicans maintain control in 2029. I do think that U.S. industry will have an influence on whatever the post-Trump world will be. So my kind of theory of change is that U.S. industry will see that other countries, especially trade partners, are moving to a world that rewards clean production. And so U.S. industry will put pressure on whomever is the leader at that point and put pressure on U.S. policymakers to kind of encourage and support the clean transition. I guess that would be my theory of change. I'll mention a couple other things. I do think at some point the U.S. is going to have a fiscal reckoning. I mean, we are driving up our deficit to unheard of levels practically, and at some point the U.S. is going to need money and need to implement things like a carbon price. And I think there are ways that you could make the left comfortable with it, especially a carbon price on these heavy industries is not one that's experienced by individual consumers. Gas prices in the U.S. are very, very politically sensitive, but aluminum prices, they are not politically sensitive. So I think that you could get some support from the left. On the question of the longevity of a policy like this and the question of whether the U.S. might see it as a threat, I think there are two ways to think about this. One, and I have an op-ed with some colleagues coming out tomorrow, or today, I guess it's Tuesday.
Nice.
Yeah, that makes this point, that the U.S. is actually a pretty clean producer. And so the U.S. does benefit from a world that produces carbon, that prices carbon. And so the U.S. right now in its conversations with the EU is trying to get exemption from the CBAM, but it shouldn't be asking for that. Like it shouldn't be willing to give up anything because the U.S. actually benefits from the CBAM. I mean, the U.S. has access to very cheap natural gas, and so it's transitioned away from coal pretty quickly. For other reasons, the U.S. kind of has a competitive advantage already in clean production, and so it should, even if they don't agree with the climate policies and they don't really care about climate change, they shouldn't be fighting these policies. At a general level, I think carbon pricing has some longevity because governments like things that bring in revenue. So once you implement a carbon price, if that carbon price is a significant source of fiscal revenue, it's hard to get rid of it. You have to find other ways to kind of fill the fiscal gap. And we've seen this in conversations in California and in conversations in other jurisdictions. You know, there have been pressures to get rid of the carbon price, but then people realize that the revenues are an important source of funding for whatever the policies are that they support. And third, I guess I would interpret your question as, you know, is the world trending towards a more isolationist stance? I mean, on the one hand, clearly we are trending that way, and the U.S. is encouraging that trend. But I think we start from a very high level of globalization. And so, you know, if you look at the trade statistics, it's plateauing maybe. The trade is not growing at the same level that it used to be, but it's not declining. We are not yet, you know, I don't think we are yet in a very fractured world.
It's like a better quality this time. It's more better quality than before.
Hopefully, and that's why we had the idea of something like the Climate Coalition. We want, you know, whatever trade barriers there are to reflect principles that are important to reflect. So reflect things like carbon emissions.
Okay. I'll open, I think, one more round for Q&A. 3 questions, please. Okay. All right, I think we have 1. Yeah. And people, yeah. 2. And yeah, and the back. 1. Yes, miss. All right. Yeah. Yes, please, you. The mic is in the back. Right.
Hi, Miss. I'm Cynthia from Impact Sustainability Hub. We are in the process of making carbon certifications and curriculum with the several universities in Indonesia. We are already launching the first curriculum with the University of Indonesia in last April. Permisi, Bu. I want to ask, how can developing countries like us turn border carbon adjustment from a trade penalty into an engine for credible carbon certifications and green investment? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bu Cynthia. Next.
Thank you, Ardhi. Professor, just curious actually to see your views on Ibu Mari. I'm Donna. I'm Donna Gultom. I'm actually the assistant to the Ibu Mari as a special envoy for president. So sorry for taking the floor. Just curious on this CBAM. While I know that Indonesia is struggling to deal with this CBAM with the EU, I'm thinking of, because CBAM is the approach of unilateral approach, so then I think the issues in Indonesia is with the carbon pricing. So I'm thinking whether your views on how developing countries respond to this, whether you're thinking on the approach of green trade rather than go directly to the CBAM issues. Do you suggest, do you recommend that developing countries could respond to this kind of environmental issues with the green trade first, because this cooperative approach that we know we are not somehow, you have to take it or leave it way of, because the EU already have this regulation. So I just would like to seek your views on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Bu Donna. And the last one.
My name is Rafa. I'm from Blue Pad Lab. Actually, I was like wondering about whether about the transformations between, like, if we want to have like a climate coalitions, and also the transformation is going to, there will be discussions about the risking, about like how do we not only just to decarbonize but also to deplatform the risking about, and to mitigate all other geopolitical risks. So the question is, like, during the transformation, during the transformation, who's going to be the price taker? because usually during the transformation, the national governments creating like the green bonds and the green bonds, or last year, couple last years ago, like Indonesian government creating like Komodo bond, but we haven't yet seen any like a specific result from that. So how do you make sure that the climate coalitions will be able to push the transparency, and at the same time, what kind of the milestones that you will see within the near term? Thank you.
Let me confirm just a little bit. It's a price taker or price maker?
Price taker. Who's going to be the price taker?
All right.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. I think, yeah, we have.
Yeah, thanks. Lots of good questions here. Let me try to combine the first and the second and be a little bit quick in how. Yes, the EU has put out this kind of take it or leave it. This is the CBAM. It's here. You have to deal with it approach. So I think, like at a fundamental level, part of the incentive for thinking about a climate coalition is, can we take the good parts of CBAM and kind of preserve the good parts of CBAM, but mold the bad parts into something that's more acceptable? And so I think like the take it or leave it parts that we would like to address are that every country will have to use the same MRV approach that whatever the technocrats or bureaucrats in the EU come up with. So can there be a slightly more inclusive approach to thinking about MRV? Or can there be an approach to addressing CBAM that, as I emphasized, recognizes the common but differentiated responsibilities, or that includes climate finance as part of the conversation? So I think, yes, I'm sympathetic to the idea that the EU has kind of put on the table this one approach to dealing with climate change. I think there are some very good, as I've emphasized, parts of that approach, and so we want to preserve those, but then try to address in a constructive way some of the critiques to CBAM. I think the third question I would characterize as, I don't have, like, the coalition, we're trying to make the coalition limited right now. We don't want the coalition necessarily to think about green bonds. We don't want to take on everything. We want it to be something that policymakers see as a first but important step, but not the whole step. I think that those conversations are being had. I think they're important conversations. And frankly, my personal perspective is that the COP process has kind of focused a little bit too much on the departments of environment and the ministries for environment, and hasn't included the finance ministries enough. So I think it's important to have finance ministries part of the conversation. And so if the coalition gets the climate conversation going within the finance ministries, that'll be a very important step towards progress on green bonds. But let's not make the finance ministries think that if they're joining the coalition that they're kind of signing on to policies on green bonds, on the taxonomies, on all these different objectives, on all these different policies. Let's make it limited and make it a relatively easy lift for finance ministries in the beginning.
All right, I think we still got time for one more round of questions. Is there any raised hand? No? One? Or Pak Yose, do you want? No? Bumari or any other? Bumari, yes, please.
There were lots of questions about the US. As we know, even though the US left Paris agreement, I think it's that 14 states continued to stay, right? So can you see that, is it possible for these 14 states to be part of your coalition?
All right. No other one? No.
Yeah.
Oh, that one. Okay. Third question. All right.
Okay, thank you for the excellent presentation, Ma'am Professor. My name is Jeremy from Brawijaya University. I want to ask a question about the Indonesian government. The government is currently focused on downstream mining industries that, exports raw materials to some added value to countries like China to make batteries for their electric vehicles. The question is, how can the government can create a policy that benefits the environment amongst the climate change that is currently happening today? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And yeah.
So thank you very much. First of all, my name is Nabil. I'm from Economics Department, University of Gajah Mada. I'm curious about the simulation from Professor Wolfram regarding the costs, because I do believe that the implementation of CBAM will charge like hidden costs for the producer, especially for the big players like China. So thank you.
Okay. All right. Please.
Yep. Yeah, so on the US states, on the one hand, we want to reward those states, right? We want to encourage US states to take action because that's where, if there's any action in the US, that's the level that will get it in the next couple of years. On the other hand, only the federal government can enact trade policy. So if the coalition is going to be reflecting border adjustments, then those states can't enact individual tariffs. So I think we might want to accommodate the states at kind of an observer level, like have them part of the conversation to the extent there are conversations about MRV, about other things that states have control over. They can be part of those conversations, but since they can't implement tariffs or they can't implement trade policy, they can't be kind of full-fledged members of the coalition. That's my own thinking. I'm happy to have the conversation, but yeah, I think that if the coalition is going to be reflecting border adjustments, then we need federal governments. And I guess we don't want to devolve to the state level, because then maybe China will join at the at the province level. So I think we want to maintain the idea that there are that we're representing federal jurisdictions. The second question about kind of focusing on upstream elements to the green transition, like nickel. Yes, nickel is an important part of batteries. That's the nice thing about carbon pricing, that it rewards, that it encourages production of things like that. So I think, in some ways, thinking through the general equilibrium or the whole economy implications of carbon pricing will be an important factor and an important piece of analysis for places like CSIS, that maybe the government doesn't actually have to do much to incentivize nickel production, but think about, well, like if more and more countries are going through the green transition or investing in electric vehicles, that will spill back to demand for nickel in a positive way. I wrote down hidden.
The simulation costs about the last one, right?
Yeah, right. Okay, so I think, yes, there are, imposing carbon prices increases the costs, but that's kind of the point, right? That we want the market to reflect the fact that consuming goods that are produced in a way that emits a lot of carbon, that shouldn't be something that the world does as much. We want those costs to be higher. We want producers to have an incentive to reduce the emissions associated with those goods. We want to be able to have clean, green steel, and if that technological innovation can't happen, we want people to consume less steel, to be perfectly frank. If we can't come up with a way to make clean steel, we need to figure out how to manufacture things that use alternatives to steel.
All right. Very fantastic answers from you and also questions from you all, the audience. I think I want to sincerely thank you for coming here again to the CSIS office, and also for your compelling and insightful presentations. This session reminds us that while the CBAM and carbon pricing present risks, they also present opportunities to reform, innovate, and align our development with sustainability. Again, we would like also thank you for coming, and thank DfD Lab to arrange this very important lecture. And I believe that this is not only the last lecture that we will talk about the CBAM, carbon pricing, and sustainability, but it will be one of the important lectures that we will have this probably this year. And again, big applause for Professor Catherine Wolfram. And the last message is, let us continue to work together to ensure inclusive and forward-looking climate policy becomes the foundation of global cooperation. Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much, Professor Wolfram, for the very sharp discussion and presentation, and thank you for Mas Ardhi for moderating today's session. Before you leave the stage, we would like to invite also Ibu Mari and Pak Yose for a photo up to the stage. Yes, the one in the middle. Okay, thank you very much for joining in on the photo, and a round of applause for our event today. Thank you very much. Once again, we would like to thank the DfD Lab for organizing, and thank you once again for Professor Catherine Wolfram of MIT, Professor Mari Elka Pangestu of the National Economic Council, Republic of Indonesia, and Mas Ardhi Wardhana, researcher of the Department of Economics at CSIS Indonesia. We have concluded the public lecture for today. I would like to give some information points that we will be having lunch at the pre-function area outside, and for our audiences that haven't known about our very recently launched report, the Sustainable Trade and Investment Report 2025, we would like to invite you to take a look at the presentation by scanning the QR code or by typing in the link. You may also visit our website at dfdlab.org. Once again, thank you very much, and see you at the next DfD CSIS event.